Before we dive into this extraordinary chapter of history, if you're fascinated by untold stories from World War II and its aftermath, stories that challenge what we thought we knew, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what happens next, and there's so much more where this came from. Let's begin. Kure, Japan, February 1946. The harbor city still bore the scars of firebombing and naval bombardment, its streets quiet under the weight of defeat and uncertainty. When the first Australian contingent of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force stepped ashore, they braced themselves for hostility, perhaps silence, maybe fear. What they encountered instead was something none of them had anticipated. Within days, everywhere they went, Japanese civilians approached them with questions. Not accusations, not protests. Questions. Endless, insistent, curious questions that would not stop. Children tugged at their sleeves. Women bowed and asked through interpreters. Shopkeepers gestured and pointed. Old men stopped them in the street. The questions came in broken English, in sign language, through hastily scribbled notes, through nervous laughter and wide eyes. Where are you from? What is Australia like? Do you have children? What do you eat? Why are you here? Are you going to hurt us? The Australians had expected many things from occupation duty, but not this relentless, almost desperate curiosity that seemed to overflow from a population that had been told for years that foreign soldiers were monsters and now needed to know, urgently, whether that was true. The propaganda machine of wartime Japan had painted Allied soldiers, Australians included, as demons in human form. Posters depicted them with exaggerated features, brutal intentions, and insatiable appetites for destruction. Radio broadcasts warned that occupation would bring unspeakable horrors. In the final months of the war, as American bombers reduced city after city to ash and the atomic bombs obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those warnings seemed to be coming true. Civilians were told that capture meant torture, that surrender meant slavery, that foreign troops would show no mercy. In Okinawa, thousands had chosen death over the imagined fate of falling into enemy hands. So when Japan surrendered in August 1945 and the terms of occupation became reality, millions braced for the worst. The Japanese government itself, worried about chaos and reprisals, issued warnings to women and girls to stay indoors, to avoid contact with the occupiers at all costs. Fear saturated the autumn air of 1945, but then the occupiers arrived, and they were not what anyone expected. The Americans came first, massive in numbers, flush with supplies, chewing gum, and handing out chocolate to children who had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. Then came the British Commonwealth forces, smaller in scale but no less significant. The Australians, tasked with occupying a swath of western Honshu and parts of Shikoku, with headquarters in Kure and a significant presence near Hiroshima, numbered at their peak around 12,000 men. They set up camp in requisitioned buildings, former military barracks, schools that had been emptied. They established patrols, implemented curfews, distributed official scrip for transactions because Japanese currency was in chaos. They brought military police, quartermasters, engineers, medical staff, and they brought themselves young men mostly, some veterans of the Pacific campaigns, others fresh from training, all of them exhausted from years of war and hoping this assignment would be quiet. What they found in Kure and the surrounding areas was devastation. Hiroshima, just up the coast, was a wasteland of ash and twisted metal, its survivors moving through the ruins like ghosts, sick with radiation they did not yet understand. Kure itself, a major naval arsenal, had been pounded from the air and sea, its dockyards shattered, its population reduced and traumatized. Food was desperately scarce. The black market thrived because the official rations were not enough to sustain life. Orphans roamed in gangs, scavenging. Women traded what little they had for rice. The infrastructure of daily existence had collapsed. Into this landscape of hunger and grief came the Australians, under strict orders about conduct. Fraternization was initially forbidden. Soldiers were not to enter Japanese homes, not to form personal relationships, not to blur the line between occupier and occupied. The orders were clear. Maintain discipline, enforce the terms of surrender, ensure compliance with disarmament and demilitarization, keep order. But orders are one thing. Reality, especially in the ruins of war, is another. The questions started almost immediately, and they came from everywhere. The first Australian patrols walking through Kure's battered streets noticed children following them at a distance, whispering and pointing. Within a week, the children were closer, bolder. A boy of perhaps 10 approached a lance corporal one morning. bowed deeply and asked in halting English, "You from America?" The soldier shook his head. "Australia, mate. Down south." The boy looked puzzled. Another child chimed in. "Australia? Where is Australia?" The lance corporal tried to explain, gesturing vaguely toward the horizon, saying it was far away, very far, past the ocean, hot like Japan in summer but different. The children absorbed this with visible fascination. One asked, "You have big animals? Dangerous animals?" The soldier grinned, thinking of snakes and spiders back home, and nodded. "Yeah, mate, we've got some beauties." The children gasped and chattered among themselves. Another asked, "You eat rice?" The soldier nodded again. "Sometimes. We eat a lot of things." And then the question that seemed to matter most, delivered with sudden seriousness by the oldest child in the group. "You kill us?" The soldier's grin faded. He crouched down to eye level, looked at each child and said quietly, "No, the war is over. We're here to keep the peace." The children watched him for a long moment. Then one smiled tentatively, and the rest followed. That pattern repeated in 1,000 variations across Kure, Hiroshima, and the occupation zone. Everywhere the Australians went, civilians approached them, carefully at first, then with increasing boldness. Women asked about their families. Shopkeepers asked about trade and currency. Students learning English from old textbooks asked about grammar and pronunciation. Elderly men asked about military matters, trying to understand the mechanics of their own defeat. And underneath all the questions, spoken or unspoken, was the same essential inquiry. Who are you really? Are you the monsters we were told to fear? The Australians, for their part, found themselves disarmed by this curiosity. They had been prepared for resentment, perhaps resistance. Instead, they were being interrogated by a population that seemed starved not just for food, but for connection, for reassurance, for any sign that the future might not be as bleak as the present. The headquarters staff in Kure quickly realized that the strict non-fraternization policy was unworkable. How could soldiers buy necessities in local shops without speaking to the shopkeepers? How could they navigate the city without asking directions? How could they maintain order without building some rapport with the community? The policy began to relax, informally at first, then officially. By mid-1946, fraternization was permitted within certain bounds. No romantic relationships officially. No entering Japanese homes without authorization. No black market dealings. But conversation, commerce, basic human interaction, these were allowed. The questions multiplied. A grocer asked an Australian sergeant about the weather in Australia because he had heard it never snowed there. "Well," the sergeant replied, "not where I'm from, but we've got mountains that get snow. Mostly it's bloody hot." The grocer nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "You Christian?" The sergeant said yes. The grocer asked, "You pray for us in war?" The sergeant paused, then answered honestly, "No, mate. We prayed for ourselves, for our mates, same as you." The grocer absorbed this, then bowed and said, "Thank you for honest." Another exchange, another small bridge built over the wreckage of war. Food was the constant preoccupation. The Australians had rations, canned goods, meat, flour, things that had become legends in Japan. The scrip system was supposed to regulate transactions, but the black market was everywhere. A vast informal economy born of desperation. Australian soldiers were warned repeatedly not to participate, but the lines were blurry. Was it black market to trade a tin of bully beef for a handmade craft? Was it illegal to give a hungry child a biscuit? Technically, perhaps. In practice, it happened all the time. A woman approached a corporal one day near the market, her clothes threadbare, her face gaunt. She bowed and asked, "You have food? My children hungry." The corporal looked around, saw no officers nearby, and pulled 2 cans of rations from his pack. He handed them to her. She bowed again and again, tears running down her face, and asked, "Why you kind? We enemy." The corporal shrugged uncomfortably and said, "You're not my enemy, love. The war's done." She asked, "You have children?" He nodded. 2 little ones back home." She clutched the cans and said, "I pray for your children. Thank you." And then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd before he could say anything else. Incidents like that were common, and they complicated the official narrative. The Australians were occupiers, yes, representatives of the victorious Allied powers, enforcers of surrender terms, but they were also young men, far from home, tired of war, moved by the suffering around them. They saw children with swollen bellies from malnutrition. They saw burn victims from the air raids, scarred and struggling. They saw the ruins of Hiroshima, and it sobered even the most hardened among them. One driver assigned to transport supplies near Hiroshima described the experience later, his words paraphrased, saying that the city looked like the end of the world, that he could not comprehend the scale of destruction, that the people he saw moving through the wreckage seemed both resilient and utterly broken. He said a young girl approached his truck and asked, "You have medicine? My grandmother's sick." He did not have medicine, but he gave her some water and a can of fruit. She asked, "Why America do this?" He had to tell her he was not American, he was Australian, and she did not understand the difference. She asked, "Why anyone do this?" He had no answer for her. The question of responsibility, of guilt, of justice hung over everything. The Japanese civilians in the occupation zone were not politicians or generals. Most had not wanted war, or had been swept up in nationalism they did not fully understand, or had simply tried to survive. Now they were hungry, grieving, confused, and occupied by foreign soldiers, who represented both the power that had defeated them and, increasingly, the only source of order and aid in a collapsing society. The Australians, meanwhile, grappled with their own contradictions. Many had fought in the Pacific, had lost mates to Japanese soldiers, had seen atrocities committed by the Imperial Army. They carried anger and grief, but the civilians they encountered daily were not the enemy they had fought. They were just people trying to rebuild from nothing. One sergeant put it bluntly, paraphrasing a letter home, saying that he hated what the Japanese military had done, but he could not hate a grandmother asking for rice or a kid asking about kangaroos. The questions took on different flavors depending on who was asking. Women often asked about family, about whether the soldiers were married, whether they had sweethearts back home. There was a tentative quality to these questions, a sense that they were testing boundaries, trying to understand what kind of men these occupiers were. Some of the questions hinted at deeper fears, at rumors that still circulated despite evidence to the contrary. A woman asked a soldier, "You take Japanese women by force?" He was horrified and answered firmly, "No, absolutely not. That's a crime. Anyone who does that goes to jail." She looked relieved but still uncertain, as if waiting to see if the reality would match the words. Another woman asked, "You think Japanese women ugly, dirty?" The soldier was taken aback and said, "No, why would I think that?" She explained that the propaganda had told them the foreigners saw them as subhuman. He shook his head and said, "We're all just people, love. War makes everyone say mad things." The questions revealed the depth of the propaganda's damage, the walls it had built in minds and hearts. Children asked the most direct and sometimes the most difficult questions. They asked about death, about bombing, about why the war happened. They asked if the Australians were going to leave soon. They asked if they could learn English. They asked for sweets, for toys, for anything that represented normalcy. One boy asked a soldier, "You kill my father?" The soldier did not know how to answer. Finally he said, "I don't know, son. Maybe. War is like that." The boy nodded, thought for a moment, then asked, "You sorry?" The soldier said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." The boy said, "Me too," and walked away. Those exchanges, raw and unfiltered, stripped away the grand narratives and left just the human cost, visible and undeniable. The Australian medical staff became a focal point for questions and interaction. Civilians, especially those injured or sick, sought treatment from the occupation forces because Japanese medical infrastructure was overwhelmed. Army doctors and nurses found themselves treating radiation sickness, malnutrition, tuberculosis, injuries that had gone untreated for months. A nurse recounted, words paraphrased, that she worked long hours in makeshift clinics, that Japanese patients often bowed to her with such gratitude it broke her heart, that they asked her about Australia, about nursing school, about her family, anything to make a human connection. She said one woman dying of radiation poisoning from Hiroshima asked her, "Australia beautiful?" The nurse said yes. The woman said, "I want sea ocean, clean ocean." The nurse held her hand and described the beaches back home, the blue water, the white sand. The woman smiled and said, "Thank you, you kind girl." She died 2 days later. The occupation dragged on through 1946, 1947, 1948. The initial shock of encounter gave way to routine, but the questions never stopped. They evolved. Shopkeepers asked about trade prospects, about how long the occupation would last, about whether things would ever return to normal. Students asked about Australian universities, about opportunities, about the wider world. The black market questions became more sophisticated, inquiries about currency exchange, about what goods the Australians wanted, about how to navigate the new economic reality. Some Australians became informal fixers, helping locals deal with occupation bureaucracy, translating, mediating disputes. This was technically outside their role, but it happened anyway. One corporal became known for helping a local school repair its roof, organizing supplies, getting permission, coordinating labor. The headmaster asked him, "Why you help? Not your job." The corporal shrugged and said, "Kids need a schoolmate." The headmaster asked, "You have children?" The corporal said no. "Then why?" The corporal thought about it and said, "Because someone should." Romance was inevitable, despite the rules. Australian soldiers and Japanese women met, talked, sometimes fell in love. The official prohibition on such relationships was unevenly enforced and eventually relaxed. Marriages happened, though they required extensive paperwork and approval. But even casual relationships were fraught with complexity. There was the power imbalance, undeniable and ever-present. There was the language barrier, overcome imperfectly with dictionaries and gestures. There was the disapproval of some Japanese families, who saw fraternization as shameful. And there was the transience, the knowledge that the soldiers would eventually leave. Women who entered relationships with Australians faced ostracism and gossip. Those who became pregnant faced even harsher judgment. Yet the relationships formed anyway, driven by loneliness, affection, pragmatism, or genuine love. A soldier asked a woman he was seeing, "Why did you want to talk to me that first day?" She said, "I was afraid, but I thought if I talk to you, maybe you become real person, not monster from propaganda. Maybe then I'm not so afraid." He asked, "Am I real person?" She smiled and said, "Yes, you real. Little bit funny, but real." The Australian presence in Kure and the surrounding region was multifaceted. There were the Royal Australian Air Force personnel at nearby air bases, Navy crews on ships docked in Kure's harbour, Army units on patrol and garrison duty, support staff managing supplies and logistics. They interacted with Japanese officials, with former Imperial Navy officers now working for the occupation, with police trying to maintain order in a disrupted society, with community leaders attempting to manage recovery. The questions came from all these quarters, each with their own concerns. Officials asked about policy, about timelines, about what the Allies wanted Japan to become. Former military officers asked about the fate of their colleagues, about